Did you read any more about the Second Amendment yesterday? Yeah, I don't want to. I'm done with that. We're not. Maybe I'll dive into that later on. As of right now, my opinion is completely and totally 180 on the Second Amendment. I don't think the Second Amendment has anything to do with the right to for an individual citizen to own guns. I don't think it has any bearing whatsoever historically, or in any part of U.S. history prior to that Heller case. I don't think any part of the Second Amendment has anything to do with individuals owning firearms. I had no fucking idea. I had no concept of the history of the Second Amendment or anything. I had no clue. But I don't even want to deal with it. Does it change your view on the morals of it? Fuck no. I like guns. I think they're fucking awesome. And I still don't think they're like a huge issue in terms of like crime or whatever in the U.S. Like I don't think that firearms are a motive. I don't think they cause as much damage as the Democratic Party takes on in terms of like political damage. But I don't think there's a strong Second Amendment argument for individual ownership of firearms. But can you TLDR what you read? Just basically the history of the Second Amendment. The idea behind the Second Amendment was just it had to do with the federal government and state governments being able to have individual militaries and militias and stuff. And it had to do with the idea that basically, please take all my summaries for U.S. history with a grain of salt because I haven't done like extensive reading. I think initially you had these colonies that develop into these 13 different state type things, colony. I don't know actually what they were even called prior to the United States. And then you had this thing called the Articles of Confederation, which I think were basically all of the states kind of wrote these like very loose rules where they're like, okay, well, we're kind of like a thing now, kind of, right? Not like Facebook official, but we're like kind of, we're in the talking, seeing phase or whatever, hopefully exclusive. You had like these Articles of Confederation, but they were pretty weak. The U.S. couldn't apparently we had a lot of trouble paying debt back, I think especially to France. We had issues like relating to foreign affairs and just like how would you deal with just a lot of stuff that it didn't do a good job at unifying us. So a lot of these arguments were made via like the Federalist Papers and everything where it's like, hey, listen, we need like an actual federal government. We can't do this. This is cucked. This Articles of Cuck Federation shit is not working out for us. But part of what was, really feared is like this idea of a federal army that could just destroy, every state army and that states wouldn't be able to manage their own type of defense anymore. And it was important that we enshrine, in the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment, the idea that like, well, the right of a state to form a militia and everything will not be infringed. We're not going to do anything to prevent states from having militias. Federal government is going to come and take, like firearms and the ability for, militias to form away from the states. And I think that was the founding of the Second Amendment. The idea that the Second Amendment was founded for citizens to fight against the government doesn't seem to be true. It seems like the founding of the Second Amendment was for states to fight against the federal government. That seems to be the case. But maybe I could be wrong. I don't know. But fuck me. If anybody has any strong historical arguments for the Second Amendment having anything to do, like even one writing, and maybe I would change my mind on it. To be fair, I only did like a cursory search. But if there's like a single historical writing about the Second Amendment or a Federalist paper about like private citizens owning firearms, then my mind could be like changing the other direction. But as of right now, I didn't see any. Jesus. Hello, I'm sure you're aware since the computer issues, the live audio hasn't been the same. The clips in the stream are volumed better. I have to max volume to hear and hold the ear. Either your phone is broken, or your headphones are broken, or your ear is broken. I'm not making concessions. I'm not making audio concessions to people that are deaf from now on. There are, I think in Windows, it's called accessibility options. There are things that you can start putting on to either auto capture and auto subtitle everything. I would recommend seeing, is it an audiologist? Who are the people that analyze ears? Ear doctor. You need to go and see somebody. You likely have permanent hearing damage. You need to get a hearing aid or something. You have to figure your shit out. I'm not adjusting my stuff to compensate for your bullshit. Okay? Good luck.
Israel will never prevail over Iran. Iran is a real culture. Israel is not.
Israelis were relieved that President Trump emerged safe and sound from that dastardly attack on him, dastardly attack on American democracy. There is no room for political violence in democracies. I also want to thank President Trump.
They're going to call you a Nazi for that one. Yeah, because whenever people are like, whenever people point out that Israel has no culture except for like the borrowed bits of Jewish.
He's heard about the fact that like a lot of Israeli food, like hummus and fucking some other bullshit like comes from Middle Eastern food or other Arab countries or some shit, and he's like, oh, they must have no culture because I heard these like two things.
For like the borrowed bits of Jewish culture that they get from all around the world, people call you, dude, that's not Israeli culture. That's Jewish culture. If it's culture that's just like cobbled together, whatever you get from like local Arab culture or like the Palestinian culture and or whatever you pull in from Brooklyn or New York or whatever, that's not the same as like a national culture. Jews are not Israel.
It's such an unfathomably stupid assertion. It's probably fair to say that I'm going to be honest. I have absolutely no fucking idea. What was the year that like Hinduism started, or like Buddhism? I'm assuming Judaism is like older than both of these easily, right? Or do these like have their roots in some cringe? Well, hold on. Hinduism is more than 4,000 years old. Is Judaism 4,000 or 5,000? How old is Judaism? How old is Judaism? Nearly 4,000 years. Okay, it's about on par. I will say about the same. It's like one of the oldest religions in the world, with a lot of tradition and history tied back to like the religion itself. How can you say they have no history? How can you say they have no culture?
A national culture. Jews are not Israel. Israel's a Jewish state. Shut the fuck up with this bullshit. Israel is a state that claims to be Jewish and has a large Jewish population. There's no real any such thing. There's no innate transposition of an ethnic or religious identity to a state. A state is a legal entity, not a cultural identity. That's like ethno-state logic, okay? We say Israel is a Jewish...
Oh my God, it's just the most, I love it. I love it for him. I love it for him because he's so American and so white, and I like that. I love that he can say that just without a second thought. I just love that I love that for him. Because you know what? For America, it is true. And I love that about our country. It's one of the things that makes America one of the best fucking countries on the planet. But whoa, that type of thinking does not necessarily apply to the rest of the world. Plenty of states, you know, are formed of nations of people that have a strong ethnic similarity to each other, and you know what ethnicity means, and even what a nation of people means, are all up for debate. But the idea that there's absolutely no linkage between any of these concepts is delusional. But the answer Google gives is wrong. They take the Bible literally. Judaism started about 2,800 years old, not 3,800 years. Okay.
No state logic, okay? We say Israel is a Jewish state as a kind of rhetorical shorthand. Like, yes, they have the Hebrew star in the flag. Yes, they ostensibly represent the interests of Jewish people, but we know they don't actually. Don't buy into the ethno-nationalism, man.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I understand it too. The reason why he's doing this is because for lefties that are hypercritical of Israel, who don't want to be labeled as anti-Semitic, the easy shortcut out of that is you to say, oh, well, Israel has nothing to do with Jewish people. So now you can be infinitely critical of the state without being critical of the people. I'm guessing that's why it's like a shorthand escape for that. As a lefty, I was on board with everything he said, and then he said you can't be separate. Jews and the state of Israel, what, why not? You 100% should. There are plenty of Jews who dislike Israel. I don't even know what your comment means. The vast majority of Jews are pro-Israel existing, just as a heads up. Anybody that tells you differently is lying. It's like 90%, I think.
Are people in YouTube chat seriously arguing about the culture thing? You people are fucking insane. Culture is a completely nebulous, indeterminate term. You could argue a single household has a specific culture. When I...
Oh, man. It's just a huge fallacy of just because it might be difficult to identify one thing from another doesn't mean that the other thing doesn't exist. Oh, actually, fuck. I think there's a quote from this book that actually addresses what he just said perfectly. It was in this part, though. I don't think I did.
Household has a specific culture. When I said Israel has no culture in that respect, what I mean is that Israel is a settler colonial state. It's a hastily slapped together mess of like local Arab influence, which they are continuously dispossessing and suppressing, along with dozens and dozens and dozens of expats and colonial state. It's a hastily slapped together mess of like local Arab influence, which they are continuously
he doesn't know anything. Hastily slapped together. There were organizations that were literally created to begin the painstaking brick by brick building of this country in a particular way, with a particular vision, with a particular coordinated plan. From what were the two? Let's see, what was it? Was it? I think one was called the Jewish Agency, and the other was called the, one was for like managing land, and then the other I think was for managing, I think, money and immigration. I don't remember the two different ones. There were two huge ones. Herzl theorized them, and then they began in order to coordinate people like moving to the Middle East, Jews moving to the Middle East. They all learned Hebrew again, right? That was a dead language, by the way. They all learned Hebrew to bring themselves together. Herzl even thought it was a stupid idea. We're not going to fucking learn Hebrew again? What a retarded idea. And then like one dude managed to, nah, we should. It'd be cool. And they're like, oh, fuck it. It would be cool. They all came with concepts of Western government. They all came from a similar religious background. They all like the idea that it was just this hodgepodge of random things. How do you think that could have survived in the Middle East? How could that have survived around an island? They were in an ocean of enemy states. What? Was it the Jewish National Fund? It might have been. I don't remember. There was there was two big initial organizations for like acquiring land, for getting money from Jewish people, and all the people that initially moved knew that it was going to suck shit. They even wrote about it. They're like, listen, the first Jews that come over, you guys might have been bankers. You guys might have been bankers. When you come over, you're going to be farmers, okay? You're going to work the land. You're going to work in these shifts every single day. You're going to irrigate. You're going to make crops. You're going to tend to the land. And that's what you're going to do. And the first 20 years are going to fucking suck, all right? The first and second waves of people that came over, the first and second aliyahs, failed fucking miserably. They sucked shit. It wasn't until like the third or fourth, like I think in the 1880s up to like 1904, 1905 or something. It wasn't until like the next wave started coming that they had better funding. They're like, okay, fuck, maybe this was, yeah, we can try. Like this idea that it's like a hodgepodge of random shit is just so wrong. It's like ahistorical as fuck.
Slapped together mess of like local Arab influence, which they are continuously dispossessing and suppressing, along with
it's also local Arab influence. When Israel came, they literally fashioned themselves as a Western style democracy. They saw themselves as better, as superior to like the local Arab style of governance, local Arab cultures. Like they came with like a Western democratic background in mind.
Dozens and dozens and dozens of expats and immigrants from all over the world. It's a colonial project.
Dozens and dozens of expats and immigrants. It's a diaspora. It's a diaspora. What are you talking about? What? It wasn't like a Russian and an American. What? What is that statement? Wait, what?
The culture of Israel is the culture of the homogenate that enter it, but it's not the same as having a regional culture that is based on like local trends that have developed over a long time. Those are distinct things. If you disagree, then you're kind of historically ignorant, man. That's just sort of how it works. Given enough time, Israel could form a distinct identity of its own, but right now its only real distinguishing identity is the one democracy in the Middle East, the Zionist ethno-state, you know? Colorism, white supremacy, and European settler colonial
colorism. Most of the Jews that are going to be in Israel now are going to be Jews from other Middle Eastern countries. Most of them are going to be people. White supremacy? You know that white supremacists don't consider Jewish people to be white, right? You know that that's not the that's not the Even comedians know this.
When me and Bradford think we can come to an understanding. Technically, I don't consider Jewish people white. Neither do I.
Like that.
You know, colorism, white supremacy, and European settler colonial ethnic supremacy are all like key components of cultural development there. But when you ask things like, okay, what is Israeli architecture like? What is Israeli food like? You're not going to get many strong answers because in a lot of cases, they're just cobbled together answers from the basic bits and pieces of the area that was there before and from the people that have come over. That's just what happens when you're new there.
I can't watch the rest of this. What is Israeli architecture like? You're never going to get an answer to that. You understand that a lot of the religious monuments there that were built before Islam even existed as a fucking religion, right? What kind of a question is that? What is Israeli? Israeli? Well, no, not even because Kingdom of Israel. Like, it's such an unbelievably stupid. He just doesn't know anything. That's okay. I don't care. I don't know why I'm watching this. Okay. I don't know why the fuck I'm watching this. It's okay. Okay. Hey.
What's up?
Okay, I'm so sorry. I went down like a mini rabbit hole and then I stopped immediately. Okay. Yeah. I read the Okay. First of all, these Federalist Papers are pretty dank. There's like a lot of information in them about,
very dank.
what people thought about our government. Okay. You've heard of the Second Amendment, right?
Heard of it.
Okay. I read the Federalist Paper about the militias and all that bullshit. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then I reread the Second Amendment. And I've kind of understood there to be this tension between like what is a well-regulated militia versus like individual right to own firearms and all of this. After reading just that Federalist Paper, and I got emailed a bunch of like historical facts about firearm laws, and then I reread the Second Amendment. I feel like the Second Amendment has absolutely nothing to do with personal firearm ownership and everything to do with a state not having firearms taken from it by like the federal government. Am I wrong in that? Is there any historical fact anywhere to counter that narrative besides the case from the Supreme Court like 15 years ago?
So, first of all, what the hell are you doing? Why are you looking at the Second Amendment? You have a debate on insurrection.
I know. I'll get it. I'm about to do this. But I'm just curious. Is there any strong argument for that? What the fuck?
So what I think from what I recall of Heller was the first case that the Supreme Court acknowledged that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to have guns and to possess guns.
Yeah.
Don't forget that as initially enacted, the Second Amendment wasn't a limitation on the states. Okay?
It seemed like it was a limitation on the federal government to deprive states of their ability to form militias, to form armies. Yeah.
You're kind of asking like, where are all the examples of states, passing laws and having them be struck down by the Second Amendment or something? I think you're approaching that.
Or I'm asking, is there any historical writing or evidence of anybody considering these firearm laws saying like all the laws that you hear today about, like, it feels like when people talk about it, firearms are important for self-defense and for people to rise up against the government. But historically, I don't see anything about self-defense. And when they say rise up against the government, they mean a state government to rise up against a federal government, not a citizen to rise up against the state government.
Yeah, I think that view, I agree more with that view, that it's the state, like this whole Bill of Rights things was to protect the states. That's been kind of I think the correct interpretation of the Second Amendment, all the Bill of Rights prior to the Fourth Amendment.
Because it came from anti-federalists, right? It makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The states weren't going to impose limitations on themselves.
Of course.
They didn't pass the First Amendment to touch itself. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, right? Yep. It's only later cases where we have this private corporation of freedom, that kind of thing. And so the question is, well, but we haven't done the full Bill of Rights, right? Like it's been selective because we think of some rights as not being incorporated because of some other reason. Mm-hmm. And the question is like, is the Second Amendment, should that be thought of as an individual right to be incorporated, right? Or is it something that's not an individual right? Like we haven't incorporated the 10th Amendment because like the 10th Amendment is not an individual right, right? Mm-hmm. So if you were to think of the Second Amendment as a right of a state and kind of grounded down that way, that would like kind of be a basis not to incorporate the Second Amendment, but yet incorporate all the other individual liberties.
Sure.
Now you're asking me what's the evidence on the other side? You have to read Heller. You have to read Scalia's opinion in Heller, and that's how you're going to find out. What he'll point to is he's saying, yes, it was for the protection of the state. Yes, it was for the militia, but it's a precatory clause. It's just
bullshit.
Stating that.
Or sorry.
I'm just giving the other.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah. I feel like it's not, because I read that part where he's like, oh no, well, it's just a percentage. You could also, and then he rewrites it in another way, right? But it's like, it feels like that's not just a random thing thrown in there. It seems like that's very like, this is why it's for states to have organized militias that the federal government can't regulate against, essentially. The federal government is going to come and tell a state, hey, by the way, we're snatching up all your firearms. No more state militias, no more armies for you. It's only the federal army now. Fuck you. The rewriting of that to say like, well, they added, because states need to have militias. Therefore, there's like a huge private interest in a private citizen never being deprived of a firearm, even by his own state, which, as you said, the purpose of the Bill of Rights, I don't know if that was a protection as much for individual citizens versus like the anti-federalist argument for we need these guarantees in this Bill of Rights to ensure that like this federal government is going to overstep and deprive states of their autonomy is what it seems like.
Yeah.
I just argued against it. Sorry, I know you're giving the other argument.
Yeah. The full kind of throated thing is that Scalia views that the framers viewed the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right to bear arms because that was the only way to protect the militias. The way to protect the militias wasn't having some right of the state, but having a right of the people. That if the federal government wanted to infringe on the state's right of militia, the first thing they would start doing is going after like individuals and that kind of thing. That's my sense of the argument, that it is grounded out into the framers' intentions, but that it's kind of like, and in the militia clause, but it's kind of like a second level beneath it.
Sure.
I happen to agree with the conception of it as a militia-based right, and you see all the early gun laws Like there weren't these big, expansive gun laws in the early part of the country. The first ones were like in Texas, where they were trying to like stop black people from having guns, which it's a sordid history, but it's not. But there they upheld them, right? Same thing in New York. The Sullivan Act, I think, was one of the first gun laws in the country, at least in New York. And so it's just been, we don't have a ton of great precedent of like modern gun control laws back in the 1800s. But there's some examples of it, and when they existed, they weren't limited by the Second Amendment.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I feel like with the way that it's written, I feel like, let's say, for instance, the federal government under Harris, wants to do an assault weapons ban. I feel like Congress, by the Second Amendment, wouldn't have the ability to do that. But if the state of California said, we're going to ban private firearm ownership for every single citizen, I feel like as written, obviously ignoring the Supreme Court case, I feel like as written, I feel like the Second Amendment would allow for that. That if a state decided they wanted to deprive all non-militia members or all non-military members of having a firearm, that the state would be within its rights to do that. But of course, as of right now, that would obviously be struck down immediately.
So that's interesting. So you're thinking like that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. You're saying if the federal government tried to do this and tried to ban individuals' right to own these weapons,
yes,
it would infringe on a state's right to have a militia. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, I feel like that. Yeah.
Okay. Even though, okay, so you're kind of buying part of the at least provisionally. I'm not holding you to it, and I think you're on your journey, right?
Sure. Yeah. Very narrow rabbit hole, a very small one right now. Yeah.
You're kind of buying into the Scalia argument that, okay, the way to protect militias is to protect an individual rights, but you're kind of taking the 14th Amendment Anderson approach, which is like, but hang on a second. The Section 3 was not meant to expand the rights of the states against the federal government, but you're kind of twisting it and saying, hey, hang on a second. This was not supposed to limit the states' rights. And so you're saying, kind of from a structural argument, it doesn't make sense for states to be unable to do this. It only makes sense for federal government to be unable to do this. Is that right?
Basically, yeah. Like, I feel like now, like, it's always been difficult reading and arguing the Second Amendment as a guy that likes guns in the past, just because of how, like, awkwardly it's structured. But with the historical framing that I have now, like, I feel like reading it makes perfect sense. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. I used to think before that state was just like the USA, but it's not. The free state, because the Anti-Federalists didn't want the federal government to become so much more powerful, right? Coming from the Articles of Confederation. They didn't want this idea that the federal government was now going to disband all of the individual militaries and have their own national army that was going to supersede them all and deprive them of their ability to protect themselves, right? Being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Like, those first two parts are really important, and it makes sense historically where it would sit, but I don't think any of this has anything to do with, like, if a state decides, oh, well, if you're in our state militia or our state National Guard or whatever, obviously you can have firearms and that's fine, but if we want to say all private citizens, we're going to ban all of you from owning every single firearm, I don't see any part of the Second Amendment that would contradict that. That it would be up to a state to decide that, would be my feeling on it.
That's interesting. I mean, so you would kind of you would say, yes, it says the right of the people. So you wouldn't deny an individual right to own guns.
Congress wouldn't have the ability to do that, but a state, because the state's interest in the right of the people to keep and bear arms is only insofar as, like, the well-regulated militia, which is necessary to the security of the free state itself, right? Yeah, so it would be up to the state to figure that out.
So it sounds like you're leaning in the direction of being against the incorporation of the Second Amendment to apply to the state governments, but you're not denying. So, like,
I don't think it makes any sense to incorporate that. It doesn't seem like it, but.
Here's a question. Why should the Second Amendment apply to D.C. if D.C. is not a state? So D.C. versus Heller is the case, right? Mm-hmm. Under your view, D.C. passed a law essentially banning all handguns, and that's the famous regulation that struck down in D.C. versus Heller. Would you say, well, since D.C. is not a state, they can't ban they can ban guns there because the Second Amendment doesn't apply to things that are not states?
In my head, I don't have, like, a conceptual mapping of where, like, just federal territory lays, so I would have no idea. I would have to embark on, like, a novel consideration for that. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Because if you kind of take that maximalist view, or maybe you could take the view that it has to be with respect to a state, or you could take a more broad view of, like, well, the federal government generally can't touch guns generally of people. Mm-hmm. Those are kind of two ways you could frame it, as really focused on, is this affecting states or people within states, or is this affecting any people with guns at all? And it's kind of like a topic, or like a field preemption kind of deal, where you've cleared out the field. The federal government can't do these kind of big restrictions on guns at all, as applied to anyone within their jurisdiction. But yeah, you should read more into it. I think it's an interesting doctrine, and it's one that you have to contend. I think with the strongest argument from the Second Amendment people are, it's the right of the people. It does say the right of the people, right?
Yeah, but I think that our understanding of, and I could be wrong, I don't have the maximal historical background to understand this, but it feels like really when we're talking about the right of the people, they really were talking about like states, not because like even all people like didn't vote right for president, or the people, you know, like women and black people couldn't vote, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like people there meant like every single able-bodied, like the way that it's evolved to come to mean what the people are today. Yeah.
Or maybe it did mean the people meant what they meant today.
Oh, but they just defined people differently.
But think about it. There's kind of like two questions. One is like, is this an individual right, and to whom does it apply? Like the First Amendment says that you can't abridge the freedom of speech, but it only applies to whoever it applies to. It doesn't apply to private citizens. Just like the 14th Amendment deals with equal protection issues related to the federal government. It doesn't apply to like it. For example, the 14th Amendment isn't like some protected class framework where you have where you can't have private discrimination, right? Like the Title VII and the kind of civil rights framework that applies to private discrimination. But the 14th Amendment doesn't have anything to say about private discrimination. So you could take the view that, well, hang on, the Second Amendment is a right of the people. It is an individual right because it applies to the people, but it only applies as to the feds. To the feds. That could be your view as well. And you could sort of keep your structural argument while making sense of the text of it.
Sure. Where does, which amendment does incorporation come from again? Was it the 14th or 19th?
There are different views, different parts of the 14th Amendment. There seems to be a growing consensus that there was some intentionality behind the 14th Amendment to incorporate at least some of the rights, but different people will put it in different places. People like Clarence Thomas will put it in the privileges or immunities clause. You have to be careful. There's a privileges and immunities clause.
Okay.
So the privileges or immunities clause says that essentially states cannot. Do you have the text in front of you?
I'm looking at the 14th Amendment right now. Yeah.
Yeah. It's in section 1 of the 14th Amendment. So it should say,
no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law.
So some people say, and there's these cases called the slaughterhouse cases, which reject this framework, but Clarence Thomas wants to revive it. And a lot of people think it's a good argument. I don't think it's a bad argument. I think there's a better argument, or at least an equally good argument for the due process clause. But the argument goes, well, what are the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States? And the kind of standard doctrine is, well, those are the rights you have by virtue of your general citizenship and so in the United States. And there's only like the right to interstate travel and the right to like basically like the right to travel and like some very small other kind of rights. Another view is, well, no, the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States are the Bill of Rights. Those are the privileges or immunities. And now it applies to the states, right? Because there's a reference to the states. The other part of the 14th Amendment, from which incorporation comes from, is the due process clause. And that's kind of the substantive due process piece we were talking about, where it says, no state, right? No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That when it says life, liberty, or property, what does liberty mean? Well, liberty means more than just physical liberty. And so there must have been an idea of what liberty was being referenced there. And the best idea is the liberties that are in the Bill of Rights. Those
is that true? Man, when I read that, I feel like liberty sounds like things that you would be deprived of for criminal charges, especially because it's followed by without due process of law. So when I think of liberty, I think of having to pay a fine or having to be imprisoned, right? You can't deprive any person of life, capital punishment, liberty, right? My freedom, right? The ability to not be in jail, and then property. So things like fining me or confiscating stuff without due process of law. So with process of law, you can take any of those three things away. When you mention like the Bill of Rights,
what is liberty besides physical freedom? Are you saying that liberty only means physical freedom, or liberty means
maybe? I think in here, I think that's the strongest. Yeah, things that you could lose basically to with a criminal conviction. Yeah.
Yeah, I would run down the substantive due process analysis, because this is the same place that kind of has where the abortion and implied rights framework comes from.
Sure.
And so I'll point you to sources where you can see that. But yeah, that's kind of like the procedural component to it is the without due process of law. Like you can deprive them of this, you can deprive them of that, but just not without the right procedures. And then the substantive component is kind of that implication of what liberty means.
Okay.
So those are the two places that incorporation come through. Notice though, equal protection clause says no state shall deprive to any person the equal protection of the laws.
Yes.
That doesn't say the federal government.
Yep, which is fine, and that's cool. It makes sense why, the idea that you maybe want to prevent a state from passing a law, depending upon the scrutiny level, that doesn't disproportionately impact one group of people over another. That kind of makes sense, right? Yeah.
But by its terms, it doesn't apply to the federal government, right? Because there's no, the Fifth Amendment has a due process clause, which, as we expect, applies to the federal government, just like the rest of the 10 Bill of Rights. But it doesn't have an equal protection clause in the Fifth Amendment. In the first original Bill of Rights. And so what the doctrine that develops, so you could imagine a law where the federal government says black people are not allowed to be public servants under federal positions. Why would that be unconstitutional? By the terms of the 14th Amendment, which only apply to states, it wouldn't, right? You feel me?
Yeah, I'm looking. So you're saying that technically without the 14th Amendment, there is no place besides the 14th Amendment to find equal protection for the federal government, right?
So what they have done is develop another doctrine of reverse incorporation. And that's in the Fifth Amendment. There's a due process clause.
There is for the federal government,
Yeah, and they say one of the liberties implied by the Fifth Amendment's due process clause is the 14th Amendment's equal protection clause, which obviously there's a time lag problem there, right?
Yeah.
The Fifth Amendment clause came before. And so, but that once they passed the 14th Amendment, that became one of the liberties that's protected by the Fifth Amendment.
Okay. Feels a little wacky, but okay.
Yeah. So I'm just making you aware of those doctrines. They're super interesting.
I'd be curious right after the founding of the United States, because a clean reading of the First Amendment says that very specifically calls out the federal government for not making laws. Yeah. Did any state have?
And more than that,
yeah.
It's not just the federal government; it's just Congress.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they'd be the one making the law, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So were there any states that recognized and established religion, prohibited free speech, abridged?
Oh, sorry. I don't know about recognizing a religion.
Or broke the First Amendment in a variety of ways. Yeah.
There were states that had their own state Bill of Rights,
and
they created them sometimes based off of the federal Bill of Rights, sometimes more expansive, sometimes less so. I'm not sure if there's a history of like a state established religion back in the day, but certainly they were doing things that wouldn't pass muster under modern First Amendment doctrine. But remember that like a lot of the modern First Amendment doctrine is pretty recent, including a lot of the religion doctrines. Like there's a lot of recent case law from the 20th century that established these things. And so, they wrote it down. But if in practice everyone was a Christian, and in practice no one cared enough to bring a law, so there was no Pastafarian or edgy atheist or a person in Rhode Island. There's a case out of Cranston, Rhode Island that became famous because one student was like, take down these 10 Commandment prayers in the gymnasium, and everyone hated her. But if there's no one bringing these suits, it's sometimes the doctrine doesn't get developed. But yeah.
Do you think in general, this will be the last question and I'll read this. Do you think in general we've kind of erred in the Supreme Court doing a little bit too much lifting here when it should probably have been constitutional amendments? Or do you think that it was appropriate that we get these legal interpretations rather than having to amend the Constitution so much that it would become worthless? Would it undermine the Constitution if we amended all of this?
Are you referencing
So let's say for I don't believe in incorporation or that bullshit. We're just going to make the 28th or the 50th Amendment now saying, well, the First Amendment, we're going to rewrite that. We're going to revoke the First Amendment and say neither Congress nor a state shall make no law, right? Yeah.
Here's where I'm kind of okay with it.
Okay.
And I say kind of because I think that there's always going to be margin cases where it's unclear. There's always going to be cases that are obviously too much or obviously too little, shit like that, right? Well, when I think of constitutional principles, a constitutional provision, a constitution and our constitution was made to last, right?
Yes.
It was made to be an enduring union that people could work with and people could live under. And there was an expectation that these principles would be developed over time by the courts. That was an expectation of the framers.
Yep.
If they had to debate what the every possible thing of the First Amendment in the Continental Congress, in Philadelphia, when they were the Constitutional Convention. Fuck, I'm forgetting the convention. You guys know it.
Yeah.
If they had to debate everything and abortion and this or that, no one would have passed it, right? No one would have spent all the time it took to develop all these doctrines. And so there was an expectation that these courts would develop the doctrines. And so that's why I'm okay with courts taking reasonable approaches to, and again, people's minds may differ on what is reasonable or what's too much of a stretch, but I'm okay with that, general, and because I know how difficult practically it is to change the Constitution. But let me give you an example, right?
Yeah.
So the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, in the 1860s when they passed it, did you think that what they were doing was when they passed the 14th Amendment in the 1800s, do you think that they were thinking in their minds that they were integrating schools?
Absolutely not.
Do you think that they were thinking, we're going to make a lot of protection for women?
Absolutely not, right? Or gay people or whatever else, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Same thing with the kind of like, there are other amendments where you can look at this and it's just obvious the people at the time did not think that what they were doing was fill in the blanks. First Amendment, did they think that what they were doing was sort of incorporating all the standards and exceptions of that now exists related to like broadcasting?
Yeah.
Obscenity, that kind of maybe you can chart them, but it's a little touchy. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. No one had like an idea of GPS data and like third parties having so much access to your information all the time. Or like, what if you put a tracking device on? Like, is that a search? If you kill someone, is that a seizure?
Yeah. Can you compel somebody to give a fingerprint and then use it to unlock an iPhone?
Yeah. So like, these are broad principles that aren't statutes. There's a famous case called McCulloch v. Maryland. And in it, Marshall, our favorite Marshall, says, we must never forget that it is a constitution that we are expounding, not a statutory code. It is a constitution we are expounding. And so everything in terms of interpretation of a constitution needs to be viewed in the light that it's a short document and it's meant to have an enduring union. And that's why I think it's okay for courts to interpret and elaborate and develop. I think that's part of what our courts were designed for.
Gotcha.
Except when they go unhinged and start doing.
Yeah, because I was going to say, like, if we take this interpretation, we're saying that the Supreme Court has a fairly unique link to the Constitution, right? And that the Supreme Court can literally reinterpret it for us in ways that the executive and the legislative can't. But they're also limited in power by other ways, right? It's just 9 judges. They don't have anybody speaking up for them or fighting for them in the legislature or anything like that, right? So you can understand that. But man, I feel like then you have to weigh concepts like stare decisis have to become like cornerstones of constitutional interpretation, because you run into situations where the Supreme Court has a lot of power, but we're saying it's okay because there's like a collective wisdom that, goes through the ages for judicial decisions and statutory interpretation. But like, if you get a court that comes in and like, we don't agree with this. We don't agree with this. Like, you could theoretically, I'm not saying it would happen, but like you could theoretically get a court that's like, you know what, Marbury, we don't actually think that was ruled correctly, or we don't actually agree with incorporation. And now you're like, oh shit.
I'm gonna inject a little a realist pill in you. So before you were like losing your mind at Clarence Thomas, right? You were like, how could it be that he was talking about something that's like not an issue before the court, right?
Yeah.
And I agree. That's totally messed up.
Well, I'll be a little bit more clear, because I think it's okay to opine on some things, but it wasn't random. It seemed very purposeful. It seemed quite unnecessary, and it seemed go ahead.
I don't disagree with you. And so what I'm doing is, it's a little devil's argument, but just to give you something. In the original Marbury case, again, reminding everyone of the fact pattern, Marbury is supposed to be sent to commission by Marshall when he's the Secretary of State, supposed to send it. And Marshall, who is the Chief Justice eventually, and who rules on this case, doesn't send it to him. And so Marbury sues in the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, directly in the Supreme Court. And he says, make him send me the commission. Make Madison send me the commission, who is now the new Secretary of State. And the court eventually rules that it has no jurisdiction. And it says so because the Judiciary Act that purportedly, in their mind, granted them jurisdiction was unconstitutional. That's the holding, right? And that's the judicial review, right? No one even remembers what Marbury versus Madison, what was the judicial review at issue in that case? Was it a gun law? No. Was it the First Amendment? No. It was the constitutionality of the Judiciary Act that was supposedly, in their mind, gave jurisdiction to the Supreme Court to hear in its original jurisdiction as a trial court this case from Marbury. But before it went to that holding, right, before it got to that central holding. And remember, if you don't have jurisdiction, what you're supposed to do is say dismissed for lack of jurisdiction. What it did for 2 whole other sections was talk about how bad Jefferson was and how unfair this was, and it was like giving an advisory opinion on why Marbury deserved this commission and why they were wrong to send it to him. And so even in that first opinion, we have huge conflicts of interest and an enormous unnecessary advisory opinion talking shit about Jefferson when it didn't have to, when all it should have done, right, under the modern view of like what courts should do, is dismiss for lack of jurisdiction. So
true. Although I would say, to the devil's argument, my guess is going to be that the reason why we wouldn't want the court opining on things is because there's so much more case law and so much more understanding before the court that's come before, or that's like prior to this, not like what's come before the court in a case, that like maybe back in the 1700s or the early 1800s, you kind of did want this guidance because everything was kind of like new and uncharted territory, you know? Maybe.
Yeah.
But
maybe. But it seemed like they were doing some wacky things. But note the Supreme Court didn't use its judicial review power for decades after that.
Sure.
And
I will say, though, because somebody told me, I think you might have mentioned a certain Federalist paper. I don't know if I told you this or not, but I did read it afterwards, and the arguments for judicial review were overwhelming. I'm surprised the court didn't originally have judicial review, because in that particular paper that was, I think it was a Hamilton paper, he lays out everything relating to judicial review in it, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Be careful. I think the Federalist Papers are some of the best sources to understand what the Constitution meant.
Yeah.
But remember, and you don't need to remind you, but more for the audience, because I think you literally say this, these were advocacy pieces. These were debate pieces. These were meant to convince people. And so, yes, we should take them as authoritative, but always remember who the audience is, who they're talking to.
Yeah. And even when you say authoritative, what we mean is what it's really giving us is insight into the minds of the writers at the time, not what ultimately would have ended up in law, right? Because you can see what they wanted to do, but that might not have always been the thing that made it at the end of the day. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
But no, wait, no, I'm not leaving for another minute.
Okay.
You have to read this paper.
Yeah, I've got the brief open right now.
And you have to watch that small little clip of me with Noor. And the reason you have to do that is you're going to fuck up.
Uh-oh.
Because you're going to mess up. Because what you're going to do is you're going to focus on, you're going to let him ask you all the questions, which you cannot let yourself do.
Okay.
Or you're going to focus on what Trump did, when that shouldn't be your focus. The focus on Trump should only be with respect to the motivations of the people in and around the Capitol, because those are the strongest cases of insurrection.
Okay.
I also believe that Trump engaged in insurrection, but if you spend all this time talking about what Trump did behind closed doors, you're going to lose yourself, because this is a debate about insurrection. And the clearest, most obvious cases of insurrection on January 6th are the people who actually used violence, all right?
Sure.
And so if you're spending any time talking about the internal deliberations, unless it's kind of like some tangent, you're wasting energy. Once he concedes that there was at least some amount of insurrection on January 6th, you've won the debate, because that's the debate, is whether January 6th was an insurrection. And so you don't need to prove that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection to prove that January 6th was an insurrection. That's number two. And then in the clip I'm showing you and that I want you to see, it's how to force them to justify any definition they come, or at least signal to everyone watching that they don't have an affirmative stance. They're either taking a stance that it's not an insurrection, or that it is an insurrection, or they're saying I'm agnostic or I don't want to say. But whatever that is, it should be known, and you should be asking them questions about, if they provide a definition, why they're justifying that. So that's why I want you to watch that clip. Okay?
Okay, I'll do my best. I love you.
I love you, babe.